Hello, everyone. I'm Vanessa Grossel, Policy Analyst at the Council of State Governments. I'm the staff liaison to the Capacity, Preparedness, and Resiliency Subcommittee of CSG's Healthy States National Task Force. The subcommittee is focused on building resilient communities that are able to prepare for, respond to, and recover from community-level disasters and public health crises. I'm joined today by Alice Hill, Senior Fellow for Climate Change Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, to talk about state government's role in building community resilience. Hill's work at the Council on Foreign Relations focuses on the risks, consequences, and responses associated with climate change. Hill most recently served as a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. She was previously Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and Senior Director for Resilience Policy on the National Security Council staff, where she led the development of national policy to build greater climate resilience. Her co-authored book, Building a Resilient Tomorrow, was published in fall of 2019. In 2016, Harvard University's National Preparedness Leadership Initiative named her Meta Leader of the Year. Hill serves on the boards of Munich Re North America and related U.S. subsidiaries of the Munich Re Group, as well as the board of the Environmental Defense Fund. She is a founding member of the board of the Council on Strategic Risks. Hill is a member of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. She also serves on the advisory boards or councils of Crisis Response, the Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education, the Center for Climate and Security, the Maryland Climate Leadership Academy, One Concern, and the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Hill previously served ex officio on the Federal Advisory Committee for the Third National Climate Assessment. Hill earned her bachelor's degree in history and economics from Stanford University and her law degree from the University of Virginia Law School. Her writing has appeared in numerous publications, and those include Axios, Bulletin, CNN, Foreign Policy, and Lawfare, among others. All of her publications, dating back to December of 2016, can be found on her website, alicehillresilience.com. So thank you for the opportunity to do this webinar with you. Welcome, Alice Hill.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. It's really an honor to be able to join you. I think all of us have noticed that the United States is heating up, and I don't just mean politically. Last year was the third warmest year ever recorded in our country. The World Meteorological Organization has determined that so far, 2020 has proven exceptionally warm as well. Globally, January was the hottest month ever recorded. The end of last year concluded the warmest decade the world has ever experienced in the nearly 140 years since record-keeping began.
That's very interesting. What kind of impacts do you see this having on the states?
Well, the national government, according to a mandate from the U.S. Congress, has issued a national climate assessment. Our most recent one is the fourth National Climate Assessment. This is a consensus report that's issued by the federal government, and it has concluded that these rising temperatures have already brought to the nation more extremes of flooding, temperatures, bigger, more intense wildfires, deeper drought, and of course, rising seas. The climate assessment predicts that greater extremes are in the foreseeable future for our nation. Even if global emissions were cut absolutely to zero tomorrow, our country and the globe would continue to suffer climate impacts as a result of past emissions that we have baked in or that have baked in future climate change. It's kind of like that blanket that surrounds you on a cold winter night, and it slowly heats up with your body temperature. That is essentially what the emissions are doing. And so we will have a baked-in effect for quite some time, even if we were able to get to emissions to zero. So that means that, for example, sea level rise would continue at least until the end of the century, if not beyond. And that, of course, brings more flooding and saltwater intrusion. I know that many in the audience are already on the front lines of dealing with these damaging climate change impacts, be it wildfire seasons in the West that have stretched longer and fires that have burned hotter, causing more destruction of acreage. Really last year, more than the entire state of Delaware in acreage. Flooding that's lasted for months on end, as the state of Wisconsin witnessed, or sunny day flooding. That means that flooding is occurring even on days when there's no rainstorm or other type of storm, and that occurs regularly now in Virginia, South Carolina, Florida, other coastal states. We also have seen extreme precipitation, and that precipitation, which emergency managers sometimes call rain bombs because so much rain falls at once, we measure the rainfall now not in inches but in feet. And of course, we've seen extended drought in the West, the Northwest, or Southeast, and even the Great Lakes regions. We have record-breaking heat from one end of the country to the next, from Alaska to Florida and in between. So communities across the country are already struggling to deal with climate impacts. And what that looks like is, for example, infrastructure that was built to withstand the extreme weather events of the past. For example, roads and bridges are simply getting washed out with these new extremes. We're seeing asphalt and train tracks buckling as they experience ever higher temperatures. Communication systems are failing. Wastewater treatment plants that are at sea level are threatened by sea level rise. They're inundated, and power grids simply are failing or having to be preemptively shut down.
And what kind of preparation efforts are needed to help mitigate some of the impacts and reduce risk?
Well, it's time that the nation and communities prepare, that they account for these future extremes. As you know, the preparations for the most part will have to take place within communities themselves. These impacts come in on a very localized basis, and it will be the communities that suffer the impacts that will have to make the choices on how best to prepare. We know that making investments, taking steps to prepare, can save a great deal of money and potentially save lives as well. A recent study found that for every dollar we spend to reduce risk before disaster strikes, as much as $6 or more is saved in damages. Those savings can increase depending on the measures taken. For example, if you simply increase the size of a drainage culvert, you could enjoy a cost-benefit ratio of over $200 for every $1 spent. So that would just help you get rid of that excess rain that is falling much more frequently. Despite the urgent need for greater resilience now, however, our fourth National Climate Assessment has issued a warning that the country's efforts to date to prepare for climate change impacts have simply not yet reached the necessary scale to avoid the kind of substantial damage that is threatened. And that damage is threatened to the economy, the environment, human health, our national security. So decisions made today by state and local leaders, as well as by the private sector, can significantly influence the level of losses. Improving our decision-making about the design, the construction, the maintenance of structures and systems upon which all of our communities depend really can significantly reduce future risk and future harm. Obviously, this task of building climate resilience is a very large one. And not surprisingly, sometimes communities may feel simply at a loss about where to even begin. You know, I recall hearing from one mayor from a small town in Alabama, and her community faces risks of coastal erosion from sea level rise and more intense hurricanes. She lamented that she just didn't have a big planning staff. She didn't have grant writers, really any resources to devote to this issue. And as she put it, so how can I even know the size of the threats we're facing and what I can do to protect the people of my town? That mayor is not alone. That question will be raised across thousands of communities throughout the nation. Communities and businesses need help deciding how best to prepare. And in my opinion, the federal government could and should be doing a lot more to help, including providing technical assistance, vulnerability assessments, better information as to the nature of the future risks, and most of all, more money, more financial assistance to make the kind of investments that we know will pay off in the end. But in the absence of greater federal action, I do believe there are 4 immediate steps that communities can take on by themselves to reduce risk from climate impacts. And those include building infrastructure more resiliently going forward, investing in early warning systems, developing heat action plans, and hardening their healthcare system now.
Could we dive just a little deeper on each one of those recommended steps? And let's start with building more resilient infrastructure.
Sure. You know, almost all of our existing infrastructure was designed and built to withstand the historical extremes that we saw in the past. So, for example, the strongest windstorm, or the highest storm surge, or the hottest wildfires of the past. And that's what we planned for. But as new extremes are fueled by climate change, and those new extremes pummel the existing infrastructure, some of that infrastructure will fail. It just wasn't built to withstand what it now has to hold up against. Given the long service life of almost any infrastructure, we're building it for 50 or 80 or even 100 years or more. I think any engineer will tell you that if infrastructure lasts longer, that's good. And we also know that the estimated low cost of adding resilience makes sense up front when you're constructing it in the first place. So given this long service life and the low cost of added resilience, it's just 3% or more estimated at the initial decision to increase resiliency of infrastructure. All of that means that building the bridge to survive future flooding will not only mean it doesn't wash away in the next storm, but it will also provide service and save lives. So we need to think about what will this infrastructure have to withstand over the course of its life. We're not really doing that yet. But if we were to do so, it would make an enormous difference. It's estimated that from 2015 to 2030, $90 trillion in new infrastructure investments will be made. That's an amount equivalent to the world's current existing stock of infrastructure. Virtually none of the existing model building codes in the United States, however, yet account for the future risk of climate change. This means that those engaged currently in the designing, construction, and even maintenance of infrastructure must make a concerted effort to incorporate considerations of these future climate change impacts. Otherwise, they will be building structures designed simply to withstand what we've experienced in the past. And we know that the past is no longer a safe guide for the future in the face of climate change. So, making sure that we consider climate change in the design, maintenance, and operation of infrastructure promises to reap substantial long-term benefits to communities. But without these significant improvements in infrastructure resilience, we also know that annual economic losses from natural disasters damage to urban infrastructure, just urban infrastructure alone, will increase from an estimated 250 to 300 billion currently to 415 billion by 2030. That's just 2 decades away. 1 decade away. So we need to get busy now.
Great. What do you have to say to us about investing in early warning systems, your other recommendation?
Early warning systems save lives, clearly, but they can also save assets, and that's at least 10 times the cost of the warning systems themselves. So it's a high payoff investment. With just 24 hours warning, the damage from a heat wave or gathering storm can be reduced by almost a third. So communities need to increase their investments in early warning systems. It's just a huge payoff. The design of these systems have to incorporate the latest research on how to increase the likelihood that people will pay attention and respond to the warnings. However, I think many emergency managers have discovered, unfortunately all too often, that early warnings sometimes just don't persuade the people that are at risk to evacuate. Even when people receive warnings of the worst storm immediately ahead. So government officials, as they craft these systems, must ensure that they're thinking about what the warnings will do in terms of actually getting those who receive them to take the necessary action. During the deadly Camp Fire in Paradise, California in 2018, we saw 88 people die tragically. And in the aftermath, it was learned that emergency phone calls failed to reach more than a third of even the minority of residents who had signed up to receive them as early warning. We need to do a better job. So as climate impacts worsen, early warning systems that are effective in motivating proper behavior by the recipients are just an essential tool for reducing risk.
Tell us more about developing heat action plans.
Well, one of the things that we know about climate change, there are 2 of the most certain impacts are sea level rise, as well as more extremes of heat. We'll just have these periods of extended, really high temperatures, and heat is a killer. So we know that we need to plan for these events to reduce the risk that people will die as a result of temperatures outside that are very difficult for humans to bear. 2 summers ago, Montreal, Canada suffered a heat wave, and of course Montreal, Canada is not accustomed to new heat extremes, but they will be with climate change. And during that event, the city's public health authority responded, but after the fact, they concluded that 66 people, most of them seniors or chronically ill, died as a result of extreme heat. In essence, there were 66 additional deaths as a result of this event. And the city learned what communities across the globe have begun to learn as temperatures rise to new heights, that in certain urban areas, we will see much more heat retained simply because of the asphalt, the lack of greenery, the lack of air conditioning, the way the urban infrastructure has been placed, certain areas within a city will be hotter than other areas. Unfortunately, we have also learned that as these heat events occur, and then we have what is known as the urban heat island effect, where certain parts of the city are hotter, we've also learned that it is the most vulnerable and isolated who are at greatest risk of dying during these events. So in the wake of its tragedy, Montreal got serious about dealing with heat. And this is a pattern that we've seen repeatedly across the globe in the United States, that after one of these events, most communities say, no more, we're not going to allow this to happen again. And they put into place effective heat action plans. It would be wonderful if all communities did that in advance of having to suffer tragedy before they change how they approach these events. So in Montreal's case, as in other cities, it created a registry of vulnerable people so that officials could quickly reach them in advance of an extreme heat event. They took steps to keep people within the city cool, for example, by extending the hours for pools, public pools, and air-conditioned public buildings during heat waves. Other cities have identified community centers as cooling centers so that the most vulnerable can go there, particularly those who lack air conditioning, and cool themselves. Montreal also determined that they should plant more trees to reduce this urban heat island effect, which is caused by asphalt, unshaded development, and waste heat generated by, for example, energy usage. So as we know that more extreme heat events are a virtual certainty in our future, all communities now should take the steps to learn what a heat plan looks like and put in place robust heat plans and exercise them so that they can save lives. This simple step, seemingly simple step, is huge in improving public health. With climate change, it's not a question of if, but when a killer heat wave will strike. And it shouldn't take a deadly disaster to spur better preparedness for these types of events.
What might hardening the healthcare system look like?
Communities also need to pay close attention to their healthcare systems, and we learned that particularly vividly during Superstorm Sandy. That storm showed New York City just how important it is to have a healthcare system prepared for new extremes. You know, in 2012, the storm stretched for over 1,000 miles. It impacted 24 states, and it brought with it a huge storm surge. In fact, it was almost a 14-foot storm surge. So a storm surge is basically water, a wall of water that moves in to an area, and that wall of water quickly overwhelmed the existing storm barriers that New York City had put in place. When they had planned the maximum storm surge they could anticipate, they had assumed that it would be a 12-foot storm surge. The city had not incorporated the almost foot of sea level rise it had experienced since 1900 in its planning. So as more water, because we've had sea level rise, comes in, the storm surge exceeded their maximum expectations. And when that wall of water came in, it immediately overcame the barriers, and it blew out an electric substation, which caused the city that never sleeps to plunge into darkness. So without electricity, many systems quickly began to fail across the city. And one of those systems was healthcare. As a result of the loss of electricity, about 6,500 patients had to be evacuated from healthcare facilities in Manhattan. Some of those had to be evacuated down darkened stairwells with handheld flashlights as the only source of light. That's because we had put our ICU units and other patients in higher floors we had put our generators in the basement, of course, the generators were immediately flooded out. Or even if we'd put the generators on higher floors, we'd put the fuel in the basements. We'd also put some critical equipment in the basements or on low-level floors where they succumbed to flooding. So in addition, it was clear that a lot of our healthcare has moved to auxiliary healthcare providers, maybe in a storefront, maybe in just a shopping center. And that as those auxiliary healthcare providers lost their power, they were really struggling to provide services to patients dependent on electric-powered devices. So, for example, if you needed dialysis in Manhattan, you probably missed your treatment during that time, or multiple treatments. More recently, as we saw large swaths of California having to deal with the preemptive shutoff of power, and the utilities are cutting off power to curtail the risk of wildfire, California discovered that its healthcare delivery system is also particularly hit hard when there is no power available. So because healthcare is so core to the essence of a community, it's an important place for leaders to focus. They need to harden the healthcare system so that it can withstand the foreseeable climate impacts that it will have to deal with in the near future. It needs to make sure it can continue to deliver quality healthcare services even in the face of those impacts. We have, fortunately, some great examples of facilities doing that. And one of them in particular is the Texas Medical Center. It's a 2-square-mile medical district in Houston, Texas. It was terribly hit during Tropical Storm Allison in 2001. It decided after that event, where it suffered significant flooding and had to shut down operations, it decided that it was going to invest in preparedness deeply. Because Allison had really halted all of its center's operations, the center then said, okay, what do we need to do about flood prevention? And it ended up widening its drainage culverts, installing watertight doors, raising electrical equipment, creating a flood alert system, and taking other flood prevention measures. So that when Hurricane Harvey struck in 2017, all of the center's hospitals remained open except one. That was an extraordinary feat.
Thank you for sharing these recommendations with us. Do you have any other thoughts to share?
Climate change impacts will upend life as we know it. It will change familiar weather patterns. It's going to stress all types of systems and buildings, really to their breaking points. It will cause coastal lands to fall into the sea and burn unprecedented amounts of acreage, and it will undoubtedly cost people their lives. This is a grim picture, but we can't be paralyzed by what's ahead. We need to prepare. We can have much better outcomes if we take the necessary steps to prepare. And as state officials, you have a unique opportunity to help your communities reduce their risks and be better able to withstand and recover, be resilient in the face of climate change impacts. Of course, to be resilient to climate change, we must cut our carbon emissions. That is one of the most resilient things we can do to avoid the very worst impacts of climate change. But we also must take steps now to ensure that we are prepared for what will come in the foreseeable future, even if we're successful in our efforts of cutting emissions.
In November, you co-authored a book titled Building a Resilient Tomorrow: How to Prepare for the Coming Climate Disruption. Can you tell us a little bit more about the book and who should read it?
I'd be happy to. The book is not trying to describe apocalyptic climate scenarios. It also doesn't really talk about the politics or the ways of reducing our carbon emissions. It's focused on what we can do now to better prepare. And one of the things that we hoped, my co-author, Leo Martinez-Diaz, and myself, was that we would convey there are many things to do, and actually embarking on those things can greatly allay any fears and the worry that comes with climate change. Because once you resolve to do something about it, you realize many others are engaged in finding ways to be more resilient to climate change. So the book starts with two central facts. Climate impacts will continue to occur, and we can make changes now to reduce the effects on us. The book squarely confronts the scale of the risks we face, but it's a pragmatic guide. It focuses on solutions, some that are gradual, some that you can take now, and some that are more revolutionary and will require more transformational change. We look at solutions being currently deployed around the globe, but because of our backgrounds, there is an emphasis on what's happening here in the United States. Each chapter presents a thematic lesson for decision makers and engaged citizens to consider. So we outline successes that we believe are replicable, and we identify recommendations, some of them provocative, to strengthen climate resilience on the ground. So we stretch from ideas as wide-ranging as managed retreat from some of our coastal hot zones to biological approaches for these threats. You'll recall Zika, for example, and we will see more vector-borne diseases, tick-borne, mosquito-borne diseases. So how can we confront those? My co-author and I draw on our personal experiences. We both served as senior officials of the Obama administration, and we share some of the behind-the-scenes stories of what it takes, in our opinion, to advance progress on climate resilience. We include tales of people on the ground, from small-town mayors, bankers, generals, engineers, who are each in their own way, in their own communities, chipping away at the financial disincentives, the bureaucratic hurdles, simply the obstacles that stand in the way to better preparation for life on a warmer planet. So if you're tired of the paralyzing debates on yearly fluke storms, the 1 in 1,000 year event happening 3 years in a row, or you are just really feel incapable of addressing the threat of carbon emissions in terms of your own path of reducing them, this book offers a way to manage the risks that are already manifesting in a warming planet, even as we work on a global level to reduce our temperatures. So it's a go-to reference guide if you want to get started on helping your community understand their risks, but also start making the kinds of choices that will leave everyone better off in the face of a risk that is here and will continue to be with us for as long as we can see ahead.
Thank you, Alice. I appreciate you for joining us today and commend you for your work. We appreciate you for making time to share your expertise, which will help greatly to inform the work of our subcommittee and task force. I'm Vanessa Grossel at CSG headquarters in Lexington, Kentucky, and I have been speaking with Alice Hill of the Council on Foreign Relations.